Hello, my name is Renaud Meyer, and I'm the UNDP resident representative to Thailand. I will have the pleasure of moderating this session, Movement 2 of the Istanbul Innovation Days 2021, dedicated to the important theme of rethinking relationship with nature. This theme is obviously very timely and on everybody's mindset with the COVID-19 pandemic that has impacted the globe for more than a year now. It really puts the limelight on the need to question the impact that humans have over nature and whether or not we are, through our activities, going to our self-destruction. We've put together, I think, a great panel. 4 panelists with very different backgrounds will come and share their experience, their insights on how they have all looked at new technologies, innovation, to address this issue of improving the coexistence between humans and nature. The first panelist, Mr. Gregory Landua, is currently running Regen Network, leveraging technology to align ecosystem conservation and economics. And Gregory will tell us more about how technology can track ecosystem services that landowners can sell and use the proceeds to invest in regeneration and more effective sustainable management of land. In essence, how technology is giving voice to the ecosystem. The second panelist, Regi, is the CEO of Hara Token, an effort to connect all food-related data to help farmers and consumers make better decisions. And Regi will explain to us how a new data exchange platform leads to better and more sustainable decisions around food and nature management. A key idea is to aggregate food-related data in a way that isn't controlled by any one company, but remains open and accessible to all. Individuals, co-op farmers, governments, NGOs, anyone can share data and get rewards for it. Finance companies can develop better instruments, biotech industry can come up with better products, farmers can grow better quality food. The third panelist is Xiaowei Wang. She is the author of a great book titled Blockchain Chicken Farm that explores how technology is changing the relationship between the rural poor in China and nature and its implication for economic growth, power, and sustainability. Xiaowei will also share the potential dark side of applying technology to nature, the risk that technologies can bring, for example, by leveraging artificial intelligence for more efficient pork meat production that leads, among other things, to feeding pigs food that includes ground pork itself, thereby opening new potential vectors of diseases. And the fourth and last panel member, Natsai Chieza, is the head of Faber Futures, a biodesign organization that promotes building with life. And Natsai will share how she has been using bacteria to produce clothes, demonstrating how technology and biology are intersecting and creating new opportunities to rethinking our relationship with nature, building a truly regenerative and circular economic systems. And after this panel, we'll have a Q&A session, but I'll tell you more about this after we hear from our panelists. Let's move now to our first panel member, Gregory Landua. Gregory, thanks very much for accepting our invitation and joining this panel. The first question is obviously, what is Regen Network? And tell us a bit what motivated you to create it.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. Hi, everyone. Yeah, well, in brief, Regen Network is a public blockchain that it provides the infrastructure for ecological data management, claim management, and asset generation and trading. And so if you think about what's needed in order to have markets that are dedicated to trading and valuing public goods, such as ecological regeneration in the form of carbon credits or biodiversity credits, really there's a need for management of verifiable claims, right? Because oftentimes people are going to be buying and selling a digital artifact around a real world outcome that's less tangible than, a bushel of grain or, bricks or steel, right? It needs to be verified by multiple parties in a couple of different ways in order to generate that asset. And that complexity around how to make claims, how those claims can be verified and then turn into assets is what we do at Regen Network, and what the blockchain, the public blockchain that we've built is built for.
Thanks, Gregory, for all this interesting background, which I think helps us better understand where it is all coming from. Let me take you to another question about the rise of technologies and the role of individuals. And what we've seen is a lot of decentralized movements like blockchain and other ways of keeping track of transactions. Directing those technologies towards ecosystem generation seems like the natural progression for the regenerative movement in general. Can you tell us, how do you plan to accomplish those blue sky goals, and what are the tools that you are using through Regen Network?
Great question. Well, so I think we see this unfolding in several phases. The first phase is the world just needs a coherent, inexpensive carbon accounting mechanism, right? And this is sort of no matter what, whether we're talking about renewable energy credits, avoided emission, or we're talking about ecological regeneration and living carbon in the form of mangroves and reefs and thriving forests and deepening soil carbon. A lot of the infrastructure is the same, and some of the challenges are the same as well. Carbon markets need to have liquidity. There needs to be price discovery. It can't be a situation in which voluntary or compliance markets have no liquidity and no price discovery. Some of the more mature compliance markets do have liquidity, of course, but for much of the world, you're still dealing with a situation in which there's no real market. There's just sort of an asset that is siloed somewhere that has a fixed price. No bidding can take place on that price, and therefore there's no ability for the market to value how much that specific unit of, in this case, carbon is worth. So in phase one, we're really focused on the infrastructural improvements to the markets that allow for liquidity and price discovery around assets such as carbon credits. That's not enough, though, right? Because, and maybe we're heretics in saying this, but we really don't believe that market mechanisms in and of themselves are enough. And so we actually have to start to transform the markets and ensure that those markets are serving the people and the planet. And here's where we start to get a little bit into the philosophy and ethics underpinning our approach to public infrastructure. So as we're unpacking the ethical foundations of Regen Network, it's probably useful to share a couple of our founding assumptions, right? Just so everybody can understand where we're coming from. So assumption number one is that natural capital, in quotes, is going to be the most important asset in the 21st century. And the UN, UNDP, WEF, World Economic Forum, World Bank, McKinsey Consulting, many different groups have independently offered analysis that natural capital and sort of what I refer to as living carbon assets, forests, soil, this sort of domain of natural capital is going to be worth somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion per annum by 2050 if we're going to shift our economic reality to one in which ecological regeneration and climate stability are sort of natural outcomes of human economy, not something that we're struggling to achieve, but something that's baked into the way that the system works. So that's an economy on the order of magnitude of the oil and gas industry per annum. So just to wrap our heads around what that is going to mean. So that's our assumption number one, is that this is going to be a huge business, right? And assumption number two is that all financial and monetary mechanisms are quickly evolving and will be natively digital. So those are assumptions number one and assumption number two. Our third assumption is really that market failure in the past, if we look at 2008 and other instances throughout history, is by and large due to lack of representation and lack of transparency and lack of engagement and participation by the stakeholders who are really both the driving force and the beneficiaries of markets. So as markets are controlled and manipulated by less and less of the users, and it tends more towards oligopoly, markets actually become less and less stable. So that third assumption is really important, which is democratization of the infrastructure and governance of markets is actually essential for the markets to be healthy. And that is even more important when we're talking about something like natural capital, which commodification of nature isn't something to sort of plow into lightly. There's controversy and concern that all actually needs to be deeply considered so that we can create market mechanisms that do work for the planet and do work for people. So those three founding assumptions lead us to create an ethical stance around our approach to natural capital and carbon markets, which has a strong emphasis on stakeholder inclusion at the layer of governing the public infrastructure. And this is one of the reasons why we've chosen a public blockchain, is because we really feel like land stewards, indigenous peoples, scientists, stakeholders that traditionally would not really have a direct line of governance over the financial and monetary infrastructure of the world or a country. In this case, it's a global market, right? We have a global issue of carbon. Those stakeholders would not traditionally have a seat at the table, and we're working very hard to ensure that land stewards, indigenous people, and even landscapes themselves, that there's new movements towards rights of nature. Lake Erie in the United States recently was granted a corporate personhood. So there's actually a Lake Erie trust that has trustees that is a corporate person. These sorts of agents or entities really do need to be involved in governing and securing the infrastructure that's being used for accounting for natural capital and public goods. And I think that ethical stance that Regen Network is taking, and our approach to building out public infrastructure for markets and commons management, I would say, although I've been speaking about our phase one plan, which is really market centric, it's just of the utmost importance in our opinion.
Thanks very much, Gregory, for sharing with us your story about and with Regent Network. Let us now move to the second panelist, Regi, again, the CEO of Hara Token, which really looks at a group of society that is absolutely critical to our relationship with nature, which are the farmers and those who produce the food that we need to sustain life on our planet. Regi, thanks very much for joining us. I have a set of questions for you, but before we go into this, maybe you can tell us exactly what is Hara Token and what drove you to develop it.
Okay, Hara is an agriculture, data and technology social enterprise which focus on building an ecosystem at the bottom of pyramid to solve asymmetric information in agriculture industry. We provide access to smallholder farmers for them to be able to access better product and service they need, such as access to financing, access to crop insurance, access to good farm inputs, and access to the market. So what drove me to develop Hara token so far? There are three reasons. Number one is a huge hidden opportunities for creating values for both for business and social impact. Second is not only farmers at the bottom of the pyramid who need the access, but many corporations who found difficulties to access those markets. They have a big challenge in terms of data and feasibilities on that specific market. And third is actually more personal reasons. It is calling for me to give back to the society who grew me and make me who I am right now.
Thanks very much, Regi. Now, I just wanted to follow up on a point that you make then linking technology. Now, what we see very often in organization is how there is often a pushback from maybe older generations to this introduction of new technologies. We've seen it in UNDP here ourselves, where colleagues prefer to stay in their comfort zone and sometimes are a bit reactive negatively to having to change the way they do things. So I was wondering, in the context of working with farmers, and you have younger ones and elder ones, and obviously also sometimes in this intergenerational issue, levels of education that greatly vary between the younger ones and the elder ones. How have you experienced and what solutions have you found to convince maybe more so the elder ones to really also join and to take part in the adventure with Hara token?
Yeah, I mean, is a reality that I'm facing. When I ask them about an internet, they will say, "I don't know internet. I never use internet." Although there's a lot of smartphone on the ground, but when I ask them why you are using smartphone, and when I ask them, is there any Facebook applications on your smartphone? They say yes, there's a Facebook. So understanding of giving a benefit application is really easy to onboard them. So the way we explain to them our technology is as simple as using the Facebook to know your land. At least you don't have any land certificate so far, and you with your brothers or your sister, you know where is your land, which is, they always say, that palm tree, that river, and that house, and where I stand is the shape of my land, right? By asking them walk around the edge of their farmland, they will right away looking at the what you call a map, so they can see right away, this is my shape of my land. And there's a lot of cases, interesting cases that I found. They whole life, for example, the senior farmers like 70 years old or 75 years old, assisted by their grandchild or their neighbor to show the land that they have. It was really blessing for them. It's really exciting for them to see, finally, I can see the shape of my land from the satellite, for example, like that.
Thanks, Regi. That was indeed very insightful, and it resonates very well with what we can also experience here in the office. One aspect of Hara token is the way that it disrupts farmers' relationship with nature. In addition to opening up opportunities for revenue generation, it also allows individuals to rethink the management of their farming ecosystem, whether it's land or livestock. Could you give us a few examples where Hara token had led to a more sustainable, regenerative set of practices?
Okay, so the way we approach, I can start, yeah? So start. The way we approach every village is by building an ecosystem by activating two work streams. First work stream is actually leveraging all the stakeholders within the village. First stakeholder that we are working on are the young people, women and men who are looking for a job in the village, and they are digitally savvy, and we recruit them and engage them to become agriculture entrepreneur or agripreneurs. So they become the pivotal point in every village who facilitate all the process, and by facilitating the process, they will get an incentive every month as their income. Second is actually the main beneficiaries is smallholder farmers who need accessibility to financings, crop insurance, good farm input, and knowledge on how they do good agriculture practices. Third one is actually the pop and mom shop who are living there, who has been doing the business selling farm inputs. We help them to facilitate. We help them to train and digitalize their transaction and make their place as become a center of excellence for them to give a relationship and training to the farmers and people around them. And the fourth one is actually the local traders who's been sourcing their commodities and selling to the big off taker in the city. So we help them to minimize the risk of the processes by introducing them to the big farm, what you call commodities of takers, and they are able to give more fair price to the farmers because we cut the supply chain from the farmers, the traders, directly to the big off takers. And the last one is actually the thought leaders. We collectively, with the group of the farmers, we appoint one leader who will manage the collaboration within the ecosystem, and they act as not the most responsible, but they distribute the responsibilities among the group. And if one farmers fail to what you call repay, the rest of the group will responsible to support the one farmers who repay the financing. That's the first work stream. The second work stream, starting from the corporation who want to get into the market, which is financial institution. They've been aiming to get into this market, but they have difficulties to manage the risk because there's no data available in the market. By getting the access to the data of the farmers, they can really see the risk profile and giving the loan without any collateral. The second one is the crop insurance. They never been a crop insurance in our country before, which able to give a real time and a good claim management. Now we have a real time data. They can easily give the farmers whenever they failed to protect their failures. The other one is actually the fascinating one is the farm input companies. There's a lot of farm input companies who penetrating the market so far, but they never been get the feedback whether their product delivering high productivities and what is the competition landscape and what is the people perception or behavior toward the products. And with the data that we capture from the transaction on every pop and mom shop, or we call it Hara depot, they are able to access the data for them to deliver better services and better product for the farmers. And the last one is the big off-takers. Off-takers, they want good quality product and sustainable supply. With all the network that we built, they can continuously sourcing from our group of farmers across the nation for them to be able to deliver the product to the consumer, and we can negotiate the good price for farmers to get better selling price compared with previous mechanism that they are having. So with those two work stream, we leverage all the technology that we have, which is the data, which we are focusing on the data, and the use of the blockchain with its own characteristic, which is immutable, to become what you call a social engineering gamification, so-called. So since blockchain cannot be changed by anybody, if someone do fraud, if someone intentionally do mistakes, it will record it and nobody can erase it. And there will be a social reinforcement or social punishment to someone who's been doing fraud, and the blockchain helped them to really reinforce good behavior, and it's sustainably growing within the ecosystem itself.
Thanks very much, Regi, and thanks for sharing quite an adventure with Hara token. And we'll come back to you for the Q&A. But let us now move to the third panelist. We stay in the area of food production, but we move to a country that is very dear to my heart, China, where I started my UNDP career quite a long time ago. And we have with us our third panelist, Xiaowei Wang, the young author of a remarkable book called Blockchain Chicken Farm. Xiaowei, thanks for joining us for the session. And I'd like to start by asking about this book, and which, by the way, should be an award candidate for the most memorable title with Blockchain Chicken Farm. It's essentially a signpost about the future of society as it emerges from various rural areas in China where you have traveled and sought information for this book. What key insights can you point to from your research that signal a rapidly changing relationship between our society and nature, accelerated by technology?
That's a great question. Ever since I finished the book, it was really something that I couldn't stop thinking about, especially in the context of COVID. So towards the end of the book, I talk about, there's these murmurings of this new emerging pneumonia-like disease. And, as I was looking at tech and the way that it was impacting the rural areas of China, it became clear that people were getting pushed more and more into these areas that were formerly wild, not a lot of animal-human contact. And now, just with urbanization and expansion, there's less and less places of like wild nature. And so that obviously, as we're seeing, really changes the zoonotic disease interface. But, when I started the book, a lot of this interest came out of industrial agriculture and these ideas of, the fact that industrial agriculture is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases and climate change. Everything along with the supply chain and the way that global agricultural markets are built, that also contributes to climate change greatly. And just also these issues of, economic development that remind us that the countryside and urban areas are continuously entangled, right? So we think of just, we develop technology in cities and it goes outward into these far away, rural, remote places. And I really want to challenge that, right? Because I think oftentimes, especially in development, we think of places as somehow backwards in time, and we'll bring them forward in time through technology and through modernity. But we're all living in 2021. And so I think it's like kind of silly to say that these areas are somehow backward. So thinking about this new relationship, or this relationship in a more holistic way.
Thanks, Xiaowei. Now, your book also dispels myths about, rural China, this perceived image that many people have about how it is very much backwards and conservative. But you actually show that there is a radical disruption that is taking place in the food supply chains and in e-commerce. And it's happening in rural China, right? And so how are these trends affecting the relationship between society and nature?
Yeah, it was very fascinating to actually go to these villages that essentially became e-commerce villages. So one broader thing that is happening, and I discuss this in my book, is this idea of agrarian transition. And it's a process that we've already seen in the US, for example. So you have industrial agriculture and these large swaths of land in rural areas, and you need less and less manual labor and less people to be farmers. And so people head head towards the cities, and then urbanization happens. In China, this is still a process that is currently happening. And so what that means is you still have a lot of small farmers. And the question becomes, how do we actually create a kind of sustainable kind of rural development, right? Where we're balancing both the needs of food supply, but also the need to acknowledge that right now in kind of the global agricultural markets we've set up, it's not very profitable to be a small farmer. So these e-commerce villages, which are spearheaded by the Chinese tech giant Alibaba, they're called Taobao villages because these villages, they're manufacturing goods and putting them onto Taobao.com, this e-commerce platform. And it's actually having these longer supply chain effects, which, you know, you have this small town in rural China that's manufacturing Halloween costumes, and they're able to actually plug into this supply chain that feeds into the US. So right now on Amazon, for example, it's, I think, up to 39% of the sellers on Amazon are actually selling directly from China. So it's this really fascinating way in which these small villages have really managed to connect to this global scale. I think part of what's emerging too is that we see, you know, this kind of gig farming happening, which is this new relationship to nature, right? It's like this very seasonal cycle of making costumes or making goods for Taobao, and then putting them up on the e-commerce platform. But meanwhile, these villagers are still undertaking farming to some extent. And of course, you know, this relationship to nature is ever undergoing, especially as villages get more a flux of money, and so they start to grow more cash crops. You know, I think it is a really fascinating disruption that's happening because a lot of these villages that I visited, people who had left the village, young people who wanted to stay in the cities, they decided to go back to their hometowns. And so it is this kind of very new dynamic that's counter to the, you know, kind of go to the city, stay there phenomena.
Thanks very much, Xiaowei. Let me take you now to maybe a somber, a more dark side aspect of the content of your book. And you show that there is a vicious circle between the closed world of artificial intelligence and its focus on predictability when applied to agriculture, and the potential rise of new pandemics as a result. Basically, the more we try to impose predictability to farming and agriculture and focus on mass scale farming, the more we put ourselves in danger. How do we get out of this circle? What alternatives are possible to our relationship with nature, and how can we go about creating space for them to happen?
Yeah, so I think now more than ever, this idea of technological solutionism is being called into question. In my book, when I talk about the artificial intelligence, it's in the context of using AI to industrially raise pigs, because there's this idea of, well, you know, progress is directed towards, okay, if you have more and more of a middle upper class, they're going to want to eat more and more meat, and we have to meet this demand for pork in some way. And so there's this rise of industrial hog farming, which has enormous environmental, ecological consequences that we don't often think of, but they're there. And AI is this attempt to, you know, really control all the factors that come into raising pigs at an industrial scale. So things like disease, you know, they have like all these sensors, and they're using computer vision to try and ensure like pig health, because if you have one pig that becomes sick, it just kind of tears through the entire, factory. It's basically a pig factory. So it's this very bleak vision, right, of, you know, seeing living things as inputs and outputs. And the example that I always like to give as very much a counter to this, and it's a much more hopeful example, is, you know, using technology, but as a tool rather than a solution. So there was this rice farming village that I visited, and I talk about this It's this organic rice farming village, and they used to, use chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides. They were really trying to consolidate their land and really, quote unquote, modernize, right? But they eventually realized that their soil was not as rich, it's not as inefficient of a yield. And so they switched entirely to organic rice farming. They redid the governance structure of their village so that, they would use this natural irrigation that flowed downwards. They did this lottery system where you wouldn't have contiguous rice paddies. So you might have a rice paddy at the top of a terrace and one at the bottom. And so it was ensuring, that whenever you were planting or working your land, you would be thinking of the community as a whole. And of course, this was a difficult process, right? Lots of community meetings, lots of navigating different personalities. And they also found that the technology that they needed wasn't available on the market. So they instead created their own. And it was this beautiful, story of them repurposing machines, working with the village blacksmith to, create new machines, using all sorts of tools like drone flights to map the land. And it was really that the tools were in the service of the community rather than posing a solution. And so they had the community had a lot of agency and control over the tools. And so I think, part of this is that they really felt a connection to stewarding the soil and thinking about the future of the soil rather than the soil as just this dead thing in which there's inputs and outputs, right? They're really thinking about this generationally with continuity. And so I think that's a really hopeful way of thinking about our relationship to nature through technology.
Thanks, Xiaowei. In your book, you also referred to a new model of innovation, and you use a Chinese term, I think, for this, shanzhai. I hope I pronounced it right. Can you tell us more about this alternative and how it might lead us, for example, to a different design for the agricultural system and a different understanding of nature and our relationship to it?
Yeah, so the example of the rice farming village that really started using tools and hacking together tools to accommodate their new form of organic rice farming in their village and kind of thinking about governance in new ways and community in new ways, right? I think that is very much a shanzhai economy in action. And so shanzhai is, it actually translates to mountain stronghold. And the reason why it's called that is because, it's a term used to describe, when you're from a mountain stronghold, you can't afford name brand, DVD players or Louis Vuitton bags. So there's this copycat culture that emerges. And the city of Shenzhen has been known for shanzhai for a long time, just making these, electronics that really try and accommodate all kinds of user needs. Often this has come into tension with Western ideals of intellectual property and copyright, right? Things like privacy. But I think that this practice also calls into question notions of access and notions of, well, what is, technology really doing? In the context of IP in the tech industry, it's a lot of economic benefit for a select few. But in the context of this rice farming village, technology can really start to serve the needs of the community. So there's this term new shanzhai that's used by David Lee from the Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab and Sylvia Lintner, the scholar. And it's really seeing shanzhai as this form of extreme open source, right? It's offering the right to repair. It's offering things like these modular phones where you can open it up, things that are electronics that are designed for literally the weather climate of places in the tropics in the global south. So it's really decentering, I think, the makers of the technology in the global north and providing a way for everyone to kind of start entering into this process of making and collaborating. And I really see that rice farming village as the Shanghai economy, because they're just saying like, well, we're not going to do the top-down way. We're not going to, abide by this way that's seen as strictly modern. And instead, we're going to negotiate these relationships, these forms of governance for ourselves. So I think Shanghai can definitely be both technical and political.
Thanks, Xiaowei, for this dive in on the concept of Shanghai. The last question I'd like is to bring up, I think, a very important value when it comes to our relationship to nature, and especially the food, that we all use, and that's the issue of trust, right? The value of trust. And you point out in your book how food safety revolves very much around trust, and with globalization of supply chains, social trust simply does not scale up. Can you share some of your insights on this around health and food safety risks that have surfaced when governments fail to mediate that trust, to regulate, to protect citizens? And I know, unfortunately, that China has had to manage a lot of those issues in the past around food security.
Yes, so food safety has been this huge issue in contemporary China. And it's been really fascinating because if you look at it historically, it's also something that the US has undergone, right? That's why the Food and Drug Administration in the US exists. But in China, it's this ongoing process of these small farmers really starting to enter the global agricultural market, and this pressure to produce at this new unprecedented scale. So the very real risk, in 2008, around the time of the Beijing Olympics, there was actually this huge melamine milk scandal, right? And farmers, these small farmers that were, combining their milk and selling it to this larger agribusiness, they were like, well, we have all this pressure to increase our profits and it's getting more and more expensive. So we're going to add melamine into the milk. And eventually this milk was put into baby formula. And it was this really tragic instance of, reaffirming that, you can't trust anyone, I guess, right? Not even the government. It was this huge case of corruption. In the book, the title, Blockchain Chicken Farm, the chicken is actually the result of this ongoing food safety issues, right? The chickens are these surveilled chickens, and they have a little chicken monitor on their legs. And it kind of tracks their movements and it ensures provenance. So from, the day that they're hatched all the way to the slaughterhouse, all the way to your door. And when it arrives at your door, it still has the monitor attached. So you can scan it and find out more about this chicken. And I think what this story really highlights is, well, the chickens are super expensive. They're geared towards upper middle class urbanites who can really pay a premium on, this kind of safety and trust, right? And so I think this highlights the fact that, one, as inequality increases, this form of trust becomes a commodity that's only available to a select few. It also highlights too, I think, especially in the US where I'm currently based, the fact that if you continue to have these ongoing issues of societal trust, of, the government not protecting its citizens, there will just be this default level of distrust. If skepticism, as we're seeing in the US, skepticism of the science and the government and all these things, right? So I think we've reached this kind of pivotal moment where we drastically need to change how we're going about things, whether it's solving that issue of inequality or also the fact that there is just this general level distrust that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Especially when I hear about things like the Sanlu milk scandal.
Thanks, Xiaowei, for your contribution to this panel. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions from the audience in the Q&A session following. But before we move to that final segment of this movement too. Let me turn to the fourth and last panelist and invite you all to move from food, from what we eat, to clothes, to what we wear. And another very good, I think, illustration of a potential rethinking, the result of our rethinking of our relationship to nature. And we have the pleasure of welcoming Natsai Chieza, the head of Faber Future, who's been designing and producing clothes using bacteria. Natsai, let me ask you the first questions about, I guess, how did all this start? What led you to start your research on the project Coelho Color, and what are you hoping to accomplish with it?
I was a student of material futures at Central St. Martin's, and at the time very fascinated in the emerging field of synthetic biology. Scientists were building new tools and platforms to engineer life, to engineer organisms so that they have performance capabilities that they otherwise don't have in nature. And I understood that early on that has massive implications for design, because if you can program a yeast to produce a particular material, then how would that interact with a designer or a textile weaver, for example? How could the technology inform what the designer might do? And indeed, how might the designer's expertise and knowledge influence how these technologies were developed? And so my work at the time primarily focused on the speculative side of this field. What kind of future societies might we live in when biotechnology for consumer goods is ubiquitous, when it's all around us? How does that change social fabric and human culture? But when I completed my studies, I felt that there was another way to access these knowledges that was tied to making. And so I really wanted to get my hands dirty and to understand the speculation a little bit better by doing. And so I reached out to Professor John Ward, who is a synthetic biologist based at University College London's Biochemical Engineering Department. And I sort of said to him, I don't know if you've had this before, but I'd really love to be a designer in residence in your lab. And he graciously said, yeah, sure, let's do something together. And so I began pottering around really in the lab, trying to understand very basic concepts of microbiology. How do you have a bacteria grow on a petri dish? What is its life cycle? How do I take care of it to be able to allow it to have a life cycle? And I think sort of intuitively, as a collaborator, Professor John Ward sort of gave me lots of different organisms that produced pigment. And I started to look at the different ways in which they produced pigment and how this interacted with what I knew more about, which was materials and textiles. And so eventually there was an organism, Streptomyces aceticolor, that was naturally producing pigment. It's found in the soil. And it, in the soil, it has so many different functionalities, but in the lab, it's researched primarily for antibiotics. And then for me, less interested in the antibiotics, but more interested in this production of color. What could I do with it? How could I actually implement it somehow into a system of design and manufacture? And it was only by growing it and working with it and asking quite textile-oriented questions that we eventually arrived at understanding that it could deploy its pigment directly onto the textile without the use of any chemicals, and massively reducing the amount of water used for the textile dye process in relation to traditional textile manufacturing. And that's when we discovered that this biological system, this organism, if you think about it in the context of dyeing textiles, can produce really low impact dyes. And so that's where the sustainability aspect of it came into play. And it sort of motivated me to continue to build the research and knowledge around how we might actually implement it and use it as a co-creator of textiles, and what it means since we're fermenting bacteria to actually develop these textiles? How would it shift our value perception of that material compared to the petroleum chemical dyes that cause all of these other issues within the environment? So I think over a decade, the project has evolved and scaled in different kinds of ways, from Petri dish to considering, right, we can dye a textile in a Petri dish. What does it mean to make a garment? To make a garment, we really have to start to think about the supply chain for the textiles. We have to think about the pattern cutting so that it's zero waste pattern cutting. How does the pattern cutting of that garment interact with this fermentation process? Can we co-develop both of those things together to arrive at something that's new and innovative, but that takes us out of the mindset that preceded this kind of shift in thinking? And so my ambitions for the project is that we are not only thinking about low impact dyes, but we're starting to think about how they interact with broader social systems, how we start to talk about the reduction of consumption of textiles and fashion products in our societies, so that we can actually hold on to the value that is being created through these fermentation processes, and that they don't just end up in landfill. So the question is, how do these technologies not only offer us incredible benefits, environmental ones, health and social ones, but how do we change our behaviors and value perceptions of these materials so that we can take better care of them and better care of the entire supply chain that allows us to be able to ferment a microbe?
Thanks very much, and I'm sure, Natsai, that you've raised a lot of attention and curiosity among the audience with this answer. You've also co-edited a collection of essays on other biological futures, and you've shared important reflections on what it means to design with living matter at scale. What questions do you think biodesign is opening up about our fundamental relation with nature and our ability to alter its path?
That's a really great question, and perhaps I can start by giving a little bit of context as to why we decided to do the project. A friend and collaborator of mine, Alexander Daisy Ginsberg, were invited by MIT Media Labs and MIT Press's Journal of Design and Science to edit the 4th issue, which we titled Other Biological Futures. And this was really motivated by an understanding that the way in which the industry of biotechnology for consumer goods was emerging may not actually provide the promises that it was putting forwards. And that was likely to do with the fact that biotechnology was and is being deployed to produce the exact same outcomes that we are challenging at present. And so I can give you a really great example. In the editorial, we open up by exploring this potential to engineer a yeast so that it produces a silk textile, which has massive ramifications for the silk trade, and not least some of the more difficult ethical questions around how we actually get silk from silkworms and that entire industry. Using fermentation processes, the idea is that you are able to start to produce this fiber, spin it, and turn it into a textile. And what we found fascinating was that the early prototypes of this technology were represented in a man's tie. And that became quite symbolic for us to really think hard about where there's this incredible technology and the outcome. And we wondered, is our imagination so limited that this technology is producing an outcome that's pretty unremarkable, an outcome that doesn't answer questions of equity, an outcome that provides goods and, in other examples, services to entire industries, but isn't necessarily tied to wishing for something different or aiming for something better. And so Other Biological Futures was to really examine our relationship with nature, which for the last 500 years has been one based on extractive, capitalistic, colonial impetus, and to really say, if we start to build new technologies and we're promising that they are sustainable, what do we mean by sustainable? Do we mean sustainable societies? Do we mean sustainable goods alone? Why can't we have both? What if instead of asking what will people buy if we make this material, we start asking what kind of a world do we wish for given this technological capacity that we're building? Do we arrive at outcomes that are far more interesting and more impactful than the Thai, for example? And this is a question we ask ourselves at Faber Futures when we are exploring all of the different dye techniques we've developed with Project Sealy Color. We are, I think, less interested in selling a commodity compound to plug into an existing system of fashion and textile production, because we recognize that that existing system is actually broken. There's overconsumption, and the impacts on the environment are there for everybody to see. And so instead of focusing just on the materials that you can produce, perhaps if we start to think about the wider benefits that's these emerging technologies can offer, and the wider pool of people who can benefit from them, maybe we wouldn't be compelled to make the artifact. Maybe we would start to see the artifact as part of a much broader systems of relations, not just between humans and non-humans, but between humans and other humans. And so really for us, the challenge, and I think Other Biological Futures does this well, as it maps out different kinds of perspectives from different kinds of people about how they engage with nature. The challenge for us is to realize that biodesign isn't about making stuff. It's about interrogating the system it's about interrogating the system that we're all a part of, and that's nature. And we have these technologies that can really change so much of how we live on this planet, for better or for worse. The point is we have to engage with what we're for to determine how those technologies are developed and deployed, and therefore also to determine who the stakeholders are. And so the stakeholders for a biodesigned product are quite limited. We're talking about investors, we're talking about these startup founders and their employees. We're talking about government in the context of regulation. And then we're talking about people in the context of people as consumers. But if we thought more broadly, then we might consider other types of stakeholders across that, other kinds of people who are involved in considering their biological futures too. And so if biodesign is not just about product and it's about society and nature, actually we are all stakeholders, and how we engage with its tools and technologies should be something we're all informed about.
Thank you, Natsai. My third and last question is really bringing it back home to our agenda in UNDP and the UN in general about helping countries achieve sustainable development, including the 17 SDGs. And I was wondering if you could maybe share with us your insights on how do you think organizations like ours that are concerned about sustainable development, how should we integrate the concept of biodesign? Do you have any idea, any suggestions for us that would help us take the concept that you've developed, a very innovative concept, back to our work?
I think that as far as future relationships with nature are concerned, one of the critical questions we should all be asking is who gets to decide? And I think that I'm very passionate about how we broaden who is participating in our biological futures through technology and other modes of research and development. But in thinking about expanding the stakeholders around a topic like nature, we are all nature, which means we are all stakeholders. And so it's imperative that we start to see biodesign not as a vehicle for producing products, but as a modality for how we engage with nature. And therefore, when we think about all of the ways in which it can exist, fundamentally, who are we bringing in and when and how to create holistic outcomes as opposed to traditional outcomes tied to some of the things I talked about before. So when I look at the SDGs and I consider them in the context of biodesign, very easily a lot of biodesign, whether it's looking at agricultural systems, looking at textile fibers, looking at molecules that can be incorporated in manufacturing processes, they are already answering many of these SDGs in some shape or the other. And if I look at Project Sealy Color and use that as a model, it can actually address SDGs 3, 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 already. And that tells me that we're not simply developing a textile dye process. It exists within this broader context of things that we are trying to achieve, not just for more sustainable outcomes in how we administer resources and utilize them, but in the impact that they have on the social realm, in the impact that they have on our economies. And so if we are interested in making jobs that are jobs of dignity, that give people what they need to be able to have a life in which they can flourish, then we do need to think about how we build the future infrastructures to enable these technologies to scale in relation to that in relation to that question. So for me, the impetus is for us to change the design brief a little bit when we are talking about biodesign. Yes, there's huge potential in material science, but the notion that we stop there is a lack of imagination and ambition. We need to go beyond and say, how does this capacity start to interact with the kind of society we want? And I think it's very difficult to find people who don't want a society that is fair, one where we can take care of this planet, one where we can repair and mend damaged relations between humans and non-humans, and one in which we have the opportunity for future generations to flourish. We have to address the climate emergency. We have to address our, just unprecedented loss of biodiversity, and humans play a role in the making or the breaking of those outcomes. Biodesign, biotechnology, these are part of a much wider ecosystem of ways in which to tackle some of the problems that we're facing, but they cannot and must not be seen simply as technology and product provision. They are tied to a much broader systemic shift. So what I would say is that when we think about biodesign, we need to think about systems and not stuff.
Natsai, thank you very much for this reply, with which we conclude this first segment of the panel dedicated to rethinking our relationship with nature. I'd like to thank the four panelists for their very informative and insights on shedding different perspectives and based on, of course, various experiences that they all have on this topic. I think what we see from your various perspectives is how rethinking this relationship is not an option anymore. And I think COVID-19 is just the latest demonstration of this. There is an urgency in rethinking our relationship with nature and finding new ways of coexistence. Innovation, new technologies clearly appear as very powerful tools and vehicles for this relationship that needs to be rethought. And if we are smart about it, and not only is it a solution to our challenges, but it also creates new opportunities. And I think we've heard from, especially in Natsai, for example, how business opportunities also can arise from this. But to us in UNDP, I think what I will come back to is how all this needs to be people-centered, right? How all those solutions, the use of technology, it's all nice and well, but it really has to be with people at the center of the concern, and ways of governing the promotion and the development of those technologies and this innovation to ensure that ultimately people will benefit from it. With this, let me now turn to the second part of this panel, and I'll be very happy to take Q&A from our audience and try to see if they want to challenge or provoke or comment or ask for further clarification from any of the panelists. Let's move to the Q&A session now.